He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sneer. He simply switched languages, one he knew she couldn't possibly understand. Because humiliation didn't need to be loud to be lethal. He believed the waitress was furniture. He believed language was a weapon. He believed no one in the room mattered more than him. He was wrong. Before this story goes any further, pause for a second. If you've ever been underestimated, disrespected, or made to feel invisible, like this video right now, because what happens next is for you. And subscribe, because this story doesn't just entertain, it reminds you what happens when quiet strength finally speaks. The restaurant was called La Lumière Noire, a members-only dining room tucked behind an unmarked door in downtown Seoul, styled like Parisian royalty and priced like a private island. Crystal chandeliers floated above linen-draped tables, soft gold light bounced off polished cutlery. Conversation stayed low, as if even voices had to pay rent to exist there. Money didn't just live here. It hibernated, it bred, it looked down from silk-papered walls and judged everything that entered. The air smelled of saffron, white truffle, and the particular kind of confidence that came from never having been denied anything. The floors were Italian marble, white with veins of gray that looked like frozen rivers. Each table was spaced far enough apart that neighboring diners remained strangers even after 3 courses. This wasn't a restaurant. It was a temple, and everyone inside knew their place in the hierarchy. For Naomi Carter, it was just another double shift, and she adjusted the cuff of her white shirt, too tight across the shoulders because she'd bought it a year ago, when she still believed this job would be temporary. The black bow tie sat perfectly centered beneath her chin, tied with the precision of someone who'd learned that presentation was survival. Her posture was calm, trained, almost elegant. No wasted movements, no visible exhaustion. No hint that she'd been on her feet since sunrise, or that her shoes, patent leather knockoffs held together by glue and stubborn hope, were splitting at the seams. To the room, she was invisible professionalism, a ghost in a uniform. The kind of person you looked through, not at. To Kang Min-jae, she was less than that. He sat with his jacket draped casually over the back of his chair, one arm resting on the table like he owned it, which, in a sense, he did. His face was unreadable, handsome in the precise way men became when fear followed them everywhere and vanity polished the edges. Beside him sat Yura, immaculately dressed in champagne silk, her diamond earrings catching the light every time she moved. She smiled politely, watching more than participating, as if she'd learned long ago that silence was safer than speech in Min-jae's presence. Naomi approached their table with a notepad, her expression set in the practiced smile she'd perfected over 18 months of service. Warm enough to seem genuine, distant enough to remain forgettable. "Good evening," she began, her voice carrying the neutral professionalism she'd honed to a blade. "Welcome to La Lumière Noire. May I start you with—" Min-jae didn't look up. He spoke instead in classical Japanese, his tone relaxed, deliberate. Each syllable shaped like a test, not modern Japanese, not conversational, the kind reserved for old court records and pre-war legal documents. The kind that hadn't been spoken in everyday conversation for 70 years. "Kono mise no sabisu wa yaya okashi to omowa nai ka? Toku ni kono yona shitsuji ga tsukate iru to wa?" Don't you think the service here is rather questionable, especially when they employ help of this sort? The words hung in the air like smoke. Yura stiffened, her fingers tightening around her clutch. Around them, the dining room shifted. A businessman at table 4 lowered his newspaper. A couple near the window paused mid-bite. The sommelier, halfway to another table, stopped moving entirely. Everyone sensed it. A performance, a power play, but a calculated act of cruelty delivered in a language meant to exclude and humiliate. Min-jae finally lifted his eyes, watching her closely now. Waiting. waiting for the confusion, waiting for the stammer, waiting for her to fetch someone more qualified, waiting for the moment she would realize she'd been erased. Naomi paused, not in confusion but in calculation. She felt something crack open inside her chest, something she'd kept locked and silent for 2 years. The part of her that had once debated linguistic theory in 3 languages, the part of her that had corrected tenured professors, the part of her that had translated war crime testimonies while diplomats listened in stunned vigilance, the part of her that had been systematically erased, line by line, bill by bill, shift by shift, until she'd become exactly what Min-jae saw. Invisible labor in a bow tie, but tonight something was different. Tonight she made a choice. She would stop being invisible just this once. She would remember who she used to be. Naomi met his gaze, really met it, and in that fraction of a second Kang Min-jae saw something flicker across her face that he didn't recognize. Not fear, not submission, recognition. She looked down at her notepad, wrote something. Then, without raising her voice, without changing her expression, she answered him. In flawless, formal Korean first, "저는 고객님의 질문을 이해했습니다." "I understood your question, sir." Then, in the same archaic Japanese he had used, she continued, her pronunciation precise, her grammar correcting his mid-sentence. "Shikashi, sono hyogen wa moto no bunmyaku de wa burei na mono to minasarete orimasu. それはあなたの意図ではなかったと思いますが." However, that expression is considered disrespectful in its original context. "I assume that wasn't your intention." The room went silent, not the polite silence of fine dining, the stunned silence of witnessing an execution. Min-jae blinked, once, then twice. Yura's hand flew to her mouth, her carefully composed expression shattering. At table 4, the businessman set down his newspaper entirely. The sommelier stood frozen, bottle in hand, his eyes wide. Naomi turned the page of her notepad with the calm efficiency of someone who'd just taken an order for wine, not dismantled a man's entire worldview. "For clarity, sir," she continued in Korean, her voice still professional, still measured. The phrase you used was drawn from a 1930s legal context regarding class hierarchy. It's considered highly offensive in modern usage. I'm certain you wouldn't want other guests to misunderstand your intentions. She looked up from her notepad, her expression unchanged. "Now, may I suggest our chef's tasting menu this evening? Or would you prefer to review the a la carte options?" Min-jae's jaw tightened. The veins in his neck became visible. "That language," he said slowly, his voice dropping an octave, "isn't something a waitress learns." Naomi smiled, the same polite, professional smile she'd worn when she approached the table. "No, sir," she said quietly. "It's something a translator studies." She held his gaze for one more second. Then she turned the page of her notepad and waited, pen poised, and expression neutral, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. Because to her, it hadn't. She had simply spoken, and in doing so, she had shattered the most fundamental assumption Kang Min-jae had built his entire life upon. That some people were born to speak and others were born to listen. 2 years earlier, Naomi Carter had been someone else entirely. Someone with a name that opened doors instead of closing them. Someone whose voice commanded rooms instead of clearing tables. She had stood in the marble halls of the International Criminal Tribunal in Geneva, translating emergency proceedings between 3 delegations, arguing over sanctions, borders, and the accountability of war crimes. Her certification wasn't decorative. Her fluency wasn't academic. It had been survival. And her mother had taught her that first lesson young. Language is the only inheritance that can't be stolen. Adana Carter had cleaned office buildings at night, embassies mostly, and brought her daughter along when childcare fell through. While other children learned their ABCs from picture books, Naomi learned Russian from security guards, French from diplomatic assistants smoking in stairwells, and Mandarin from a janitor who'd once been a professor in Shanghai. By 12, she could curse in 7 languages. By 18, she could negotiate in 5. By 24, she was translating war crime testimony while men in suits decided who lived and who disappeared into unmarked graves. Then her mother disappeared too. Not into a grave. At least, Naomi didn't think so. Adana had simply called one Tuesday morning and said, "Baby, I need you to forget my name for a while." Her voice had been calm, too calm. The kind of calm that came right before everything collapsed. 3 weeks later, men in expensive cars started asking questions at Naomi's apartment. Polite questions. The kind that felt like knives wrapped in silk. Where is she? What did she tell you? What did she take? Naomi had answered in flawless legalese, offering nothing, revealing less. But she understood the message. Her mother had seen something, heard something, or translated something she shouldn't have. And now the debt was transferring. Inheritance, it turned out, came in many forms. So Naomi Carter became Naomi Kim, then Naomi Osei, then just Naomi, a woman without a last name, without references, without a past that could be traced. She traded Geneva's marble halls for Seoul's back-alley hostels. She traded her translator credentials for a forged work visa. She traded her voice for silence, and she survived. For 2 years, she'd kept her head down, her languages locked away like contraband. She'd served wine to men who spoke 4 languages poorly and believed it made them cultured. She'd smiled through propositions delivered in broken English. She'd pretended not to understand when customers spoke about her in French, Japanese, Mandarin, assuming she was decoration, not documentation. She had made herself invisible, and it had worked. Until tonight. Until Kang Min-jae looked at her scuffed shoes and decided she was beneath language itself. Until he chose classical Japanese, that particular dialect, yet that particular insult, and deployed it like a scalpel in front of witnesses. He hadn't just tried to humiliate her. He'd tried to erase her, and Naomi Carter, the woman who'd translated testimony about villages burned and children disappeared, understood erasure. She'd watched it happen in 4 languages. She'd documented it in legal transcripts that no one read. She knew what it looked like. She knew what it cost. And she knew, standing there in La Lumière Noire with her notepad and her splitting shoes, that some things, some humiliations, demanded a response. Not because she wanted revenge, but because silence, she'd learned, was just another form of disappearing. So when Min-jae spoke in that dead language, when he watched her with that expectant cruelty, when the room held its breath waiting for her to crumble, Naomi made a choice. She opened her mouth, and Geneva spoke. Geneva, 2 years earlier. The tribunal chamber smelled of old wood and new fear. Naomi sat in the translator's booth, headphones pressed tight against her ears, watching 3 men argue over the precise definition of a massacre. The Russian delegate insisted it was civil unrest. The French ambassador called it regrettable violence. The Ukrainian prosecutor, voice shaking with barely contained rage, called it what it was, genocide. Her job wasn't to choose sides. Her job was to make sure the words traveled intact. She translated the Russians' euphemisms with clinical precision. She rendered the French diplomats' carefully hedged language without softening its evasion. And when the prosecutor described what satellite images had found in the forest outside Bucha, the shallow graves, the bound hands, just the children, she translated every syllable, even as her own hands trembled. 16 bodies, she said into the microphone, her voice steady in 3 languages simultaneously. Ages estimated between 4 and 12. Cause of death, execution style. The Russian delegate slammed his folder shut. The French ambassador closed his eyes. The Ukrainian prosecutor continued relentless, and Naomi continued with him. Because that was the job. That was the armor. Her mother had taught her that language wasn't just communication. It was survival. Adana Carter had grown up in Lagos, moved to London at 16, then Paris, then Geneva, working her way through countries by learning their words faster than their borders could reject her. People can take your money, baby, she'd told Naomi 1,000 times, by polishing embassy floors while her daughter did homework in the supply closet. They can take your home, your papers, your name, but they can't take what's in here. She'd tap Naomi's forehead. Learn everything. Forget nothing. Language is the only inheritance that survives. So Naomi had learned French from her mother's employers, Russian from the security guard who snuck her candy, Mandarin from Mr. Liu, who cleaned the Chinese consulate and had once been a literature professor before the Cultural Revolution made that too dangerous. By the time she was 24, Naomi held certifications in 6 languages and contracts with 4 international agencies. She wasn't just fluent, she was precise. She understood that in rooms where wars were negotiated and atrocities documented, how a single mistranslated word could mean the difference between justice and impunity. She had power. Not the kind that came from money or position, but the kind that came from being necessary, from being the only voice that could carry meaning across borders. Then her mother called, "Baby, I need you to forget my name for a while." Adana's voice had been calm, too calm, the way it got when she was terrified and refusing to show it. She didn't explain, she didn't apologize, she just said, "Trust me, and don't come looking." The line went dead. 3 weeks later, 2 men in expensive suits appeared at Naomi's apartment door. They knew her schedule. They knew her mother's cleaning route. They knew things that shouldn't have been knowable. "We're looking for Adana Carter," the first one said, his smile polite, his eyes empty. "We believe she may have overheard something, translated something, taken something that wasn't hers." Naomi had stood in her doorway, the same doorway where diplomatic couriers delivered urgent documents, where colleagues dropped off files for high-security cases, and understood instantly. Her mother had heard something, in one of those embassies, in one of those offices she cleaned while men in power thought she was furniture, and now the debt was transferring. Naomi disappeared 3 days later. New name, new country. New life built on the principle of absolute invisibility. She stopped speaking 6 languages and started speaking 1, the universal language of service. "Yes, sir, right away, of course." She became the kind of person powerful men looked through, not at. She survived. And she told herself it was enough, that survival was its own kind of victory, until tonight. Until Min Jae looked at her and decided she wasn't worth the effort of basic respect. Until he used language as a weapon and expected her to accept the wound in silence. La lumière noire. Present, Min Jae leaned back in his chair, studying her now with something between suspicion and fascination. Yura's hand had gone still on her wine glass. The sommelier hadn't moved. The room waited. "Interesting," Min Jae said slowly, his voice carrying a new edge. "Then answer this." He switched languages again, this time into Mandarin layered with regional idioms, the kind designed to trip up even native speakers. Testing her, hunting for the limits of what she knew. Min Jae's Mandarin rolled out smooth and deliberate. Each syllable precisely weighted. Jing di zhuwa, yun zhi donghai zhi da. A frog at the bottom of a well. How could it know the vastness of the Eastern Sea? But he didn't stop there. He layered it, twisted it, added a regional Sichuan modifier that turned the ancient proverb into something crueler. yet it croaks as though it has seen the ocean. It was elegant, vicious, the kind of insult that required not just fluency, but deep cultural knowledge to even recognize as an attack. Around the table, the shift was immediate. The businessman at table 4 set down his wine glass with deliberate care. The couple near the window stopped pretending to eat. Even the sommelier, who'd seen years of power plays in this room, went absolutely still. Everyone understood the performance, even if they didn't speak the language. Min-jae was hunting now. Yura's fingers tightened on her clutch, her knuckles going white. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it, some old survival instinct warning her that interruption would only make things worse. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply held her pen above the notepad for 3 long seconds, long enough that Min-jae's smile started to curl at the edges, long enough that he began to believe he'd finally found her limit. Then she spoke, not quickly, not defensively, with the measured precision of someone who'd once corrected diplomats in real time. Nin yin yong de cheng yu, she began in flawless Mandarin, her accent carrying the neutral clarity of professional translation, Chuzi Zhuangzi Qiushui. The idiom you're quoting comes from Zhuangzi's Autumn Floods. She paused, letting the room absorb that, then continued. 但在原文中，这个比喻不是用来侮辱服务员的。But in the original text, this metaphor wasn't used to insult servants. Min-jae's smile faltered. 它是庄子用来描述那些困在权力中的人。Her voice remained perfectly calm, perfectly professional. 那些认为自己的小世界就是整个宇宙的人。It was Zhuangzi's way of describing those trapped in power, those who mistake their small world for the entire universe. The businessman at table 4 coughed into his napkin. Naomi turned the page of her notepad with infuriating composure, then looked up and switched seamlessly into Korean, her tone still carrying the same measured politeness. 그리고 제가 기억하기로는 우물 속 개구리의 이야기는 무지에 대한 것이 아니라 두려움에 대한 것입니다. And if I recall correctly, the story of the frog in the well isn't about ignorance, it's about fear. She met his eyes directly now. 우물을 떠나는 것이 두려워서 밖의 세상이 존재하지 않는다고 스스로를 설득하는 사람들의 이야기입니다. It's about those who are so afraid to leave their well that they convince themselves the outside world doesn't exist. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. Yura's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, not with shock at Naomi's fluency, but with recognition of what had just happened. She'd watched Min-jae deploy this particular tactic before. She'd seen him use classical references to humiliate people in 4 countries. She'd never seen anyone turn it back on him. The sommelier took an involuntary step backward, as if the shift in power dynamics had physical force. At table 4, the businessman was no longer even pretending to read his newspaper. He was staring openly now, his expression caught between fascination and second-hand mortification. Min-jae stood slowly. The movement was deliberate, calculated to reclaim physical dominance in a moment where intellectual authority had just been stripped from him. His chair scraped against marble, the sound unnaturally loud in the suspended quiet. His jaw was tight, the veins in his neck were visible. The careful mask of urbane superiority had cracked, revealing something harder underneath. Something dangerous. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and sharp. Not what's your name, not where did you learn that, who are you? Because he understood now, finally, belatedly, that the woman standing before him wasn't just educated, she was trained. The kind of training that didn't come from language apps or university courses. The kind that came from rooms where words determined whether cities burned or ceasefires held. But Naomi set her pen down with the same careful precision she'd maintained throughout the entire exchange. Her expression hadn't changed. Her posture hadn't shifted. To anyone watching, she was still just a waitress taking an order. But her eyes, for just one fraction of a second, carried something that made Min-jae take an involuntary step back. Recognition. Not of him, of what he represented. "Your waitress," she said quietly in Korean, her voice carrying just far enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Would you prefer the tasting menu, or shall I give you a moment to decide?" Min-jae laughed. It wasn't the polished laugh he'd used earlier with Yura, the one designed to signal control and amusement. This was something sharper, thinner, and the sound of a man watching his carefully constructed performance collapse and deciding to burn the theater down rather than admit defeat. "Your waitress," he repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. Then his expression shifted, calculation replacing embarrassment. "You're recording this." Naomi blinked. "I'm sorry?" "You're recording." He gestured at her with one hand, his movements too quick, too sharp. No one learns classical Japanese by accident. No one corrects Mandarin idioms while taking wine orders. His voice rose, projecting now to the entire dining room. "You're a plant, industrial espionage, or blackmail." Yura's face went pale. "Min-jae, that's—" "Be quiet." He didn't look at her. The businessman at table 4 shifted uncomfortably, his phone now in his hand, not using it, but ready. The couple by the window exchanged glances, the kind of silent conversation that happened when witnesses realized they might need alibis. Naomi kept her hands visible, her notepad closed. "Sir, I'm not recording anything. I'm simply, You're lying." Min-jae's hand went to his pocket, then stopped, some instinct warning him that whatever he was reaching for wouldn't help. Instead, he turned sharply toward the entrance. "Victor!" The floor manager appeared so quickly he must have been watching from the shadows. His face was already arranged in practiced deference, but Naomi could see the calculation in his eyes, the math of power, the economics of blame. "Mr. Kang," Victor said smoothly, moving between tables with the efficiency of a man who'd spent decades managing crises. "Is everything—" "Check her." Min-jae's voice had gone cold. A corporate. The tone of someone used to having instructions followed without question. "Phone, pockets, everything. She's recording." Victor's eyes flicked to Naomi. She saw the question there, saw him weighing her 2 years of quiet competence against Kang Min-jae's platinum membership card. She knew which way the scale would tip. "Miss Carter," Victor said carefully, "would you mind stepping into the—" "She's a spy," Min-jae interrupted. "Or worse. Call the police. I want her searched properly. I want her credentials verified." He gestured dismissively. "Whatever name she gave you, it's probably fake." The words hit like ice water. "Whatever name she gave you." Naomi's pulse spiked. Her hands went cold. She forced herself to keep breathing, to keep her expression neutral. Even as her mind raced through contingencies she'd spent 2 years trying not to think about. Credentials, verification, police, the 3 things she couldn't survive. Her work visa was forged. Good enough to fool a restaurant manager, not good enough for a background check. Her references were invented. Her entire identity was scaffolding built over a void, and Min-jae had just threatened to tear it down because she'd wounded his pride. She thought of her mother, that last phone call. "Baby, I need you to forget my name for a while." She thought of the men in expensive suits who'd appeared at her door in Geneva asking polite questions that felt like threats. She thought of 2 years of silence, 2 years of survival, 2 years of making herself invisible, irrelevant, beneath notice. All of it about to collapse because she'd forgotten the first rule. Never remind powerful men that you exist. Victor was looking at her differently now, not with sympathy but with the cold assessment of someone calculating liability. "Miss Carter, if you could please—" "I know what she's doing." Min-jae's voice cut through again, sharper now, louder. He was playing to the room, rebuilding his authority through volume and accusation. This is a setup. Someone sent her. Someone paid her to embarrass me in front of... He gestured vaguely at Yura, at the other diners, at the cathedral of wealth and power they occupied. Naomi could see it happening in real time, the narrative shifting, the story being rewritten. She wasn't a competent employee anymore. She was suspicious, foreign, too educated for her position, someone who didn't belong, someone who needed to be removed. The sommelier had backed away to the bar. The other servers had disappeared into the kitchen. Even Yura had gone very still, her expression carefully blank. The look of someone who'd learned not to interfere when Min-jae was remaking reality. Naomi stood alone in the center of the room, notepad in hand, while the machinery of power began grinding toward her. Victor's phone was already out. "I'll need to call." "Do you know who I am?" Min-jae asked. He wasn't looking at Naomi anymore. He was looking at Victor. And the question wasn't a question at all. It was a reminder of exactly how much power he held, how many doors he could close, how thoroughly he could destroy not just Naomi, but anyone who chose to protect her. The figure rose from the corner booth so quietly that at first, only Naomi noticed. But he was small, old, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that had been tailored somewhere expensive and subtle, the kind of place that didn't advertise because it didn't need to. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, carrying the particular authority of someone who'd spent decades learning that power didn't need to announce itself. Chairman Park stepped into the light. The room didn't just go quiet, it transformed. The businessman at table 4 shot to his feet so quickly his chair tipped backward. The sommelier's hand went to his chest as if steadying his heart. Even Victor, practiced, professional Victor, went absolutely rigid, his phone forgotten in his hand. Min-jae turned and froze. The color drained from his face so quickly it looked like a magic trick. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His hands, which had been gesturing broadly seconds before, dropped to his sides. "Chairman Park," he managed, his voice stripped of all its earlier venom. "I didn't realize you were..." "Clearly." Park's voice was soft, almost gentle, but it cut through the room like a blade through silk. He didn't raise it, didn't need to. He walked slowly toward their table, his footsteps nearly silent on the marble. The entire dining room tracked his movement, not because he demanded attention, but because power of this magnitude created its own gravity. Naomi had seen this before in Geneva when certain names entered a room and entire delegations rearranged themselves like planets around a star. She'd translated for men like this, men who could end careers with a phone call, shift policy with a conversation, make people disappear with nothing more than a disappointed silence. But she'd never expected to see one here. Park stopped 3 feet from their table. He didn't look at Min-jae yet. He looked at Naomi, really looked at her. And in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. Recognition. Not of her uniform or her face, of who she'd been, who she was, Miss Carter, he said quietly, and the use of her real name, her actual name, not the half-dozen aliases she'd cycled through, landed like a small earthquake. "You still speak like someone who refuses to be erased." Naomi's mind raced. Geneva, the tribunals, had she translated for him? Had he been in one of those rooms, or was it something else, something connected to her mother? To the reason she'd disappeared in the first place? She couldn't remember, couldn't place him, but he clearly placed her. Park turned to Min-jae then, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "You used language to humiliate an employee," Park said. His voice remained soft, conversational, devastating. "Then you threatened her, in my restaurant." Min-jae swallowed hard. "Chairman, I didn't realize..." "You rarely do." Park's expression didn't change. Which is why you'll apologize and leave. Silence. The kind that pressed against eardrums. Min-jae's jaw worked soundlessly, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Naomi could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of costs and consequences, the weighing of pride against survival. Park simply waited. He didn't repeat himself, didn't threaten, didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood exactly what was happening. Min-jae's entire social architecture, his memberships, his reputation, his access to rooms like this, hung in the balance of the next 10 seconds. Yura moved first. She stood slowly, carefully, and removed her hand from Min-jae's arm with the deliberate precision of someone severing a connection. Her face was composed, but Naomi caught the flash of something in her eyes, relief maybe, or recognition that she'd just been given an exit from something she'd endured too long. "I'll wait outside," Yura said quietly. She didn't wait for Min-jae's response, didn't look back. She simply walked toward the entrance, her heels clicking against marble, and disappeared into the night. Min-jae watched her go, something crumbling behind his carefully constructed mask. But when he turned back to Naomi, his face had changed. The superiority was gone. The contempt was gone. What remained was hollow, defeated. "I'm sorry," he said. The words came out flat, mechanical, the kind of apology that acknowledged the performance requirement without containing any actual remorse. But Park didn't seem to care about sincerity. He cared about compliance. "Again," Park said softly, "with her name." Min-jae's throat worked. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter." Naomi nodded once. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The silence said everything. Min-jae collected his jacket from the chair with movements that had lost all their earlier confidence. He walked toward the exit like a man who'd just watched his reflection shatter. Carefully, as if afraid the pieces might cut him on the way out. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the room exhaled. Conversations resumed in careful whispers. Silverware returned to plates. The sommelier disappeared into the wine cellar as if seeking sanctuary. Park turned back to Naomi. His expression hadn't changed, still calm, still measured. But there was something in his eyes now. A question, or perhaps an invitation. "Miss Carter," he said, "would you join me?" It wasn't really a question. The office existed behind a door Naomi had passed 1,000 times without noticing. No nameplate, no signage, just dark wood and brushed brass that blended seamlessly into the restaurant's paneled walls. Park opened it with a key he didn't need to search for, gesturing for her to enter. Inside, the space was smaller than she expected. Elegant but not ostentatious. A single desk, 2 chairs, bookshelves lined with volumes in Korean, English, French, and, she noticed with a strange jolt, Khmer. Park gestured to one of the chairs. Naomi sat, still holding her notepad like a shield. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he moved to a small cabinet and poured 2 glasses of water. Not wine, not liquor, before settling across from her. "Geneva, 2023, he said without preamble. "The tribunal hearings on the Mariupol evacuation routes. You translated the satellite analyst's testimony. 16 hours straight, 3 languages simultaneously." Naomi's fingers tightened on the notepad. I was there." Park's voice remained gentle. "Not in the gallery, in the observation room. I represented certain interests that preferred to remain unattributed." He took a small sip of water, giving her time to process. "You mistranslated once," he continued, "deliberately. The Russian delegate used a phrase that, if translated accurately, would have constituted an admission of command responsibility. You softened it by 1/2 a degree, Enough that he didn't realize what he'd revealed, but clear enough that the prosecutors caught it. Naomi's breath stopped. She remembered that moment, the split-second calculation. The delegate had been careless, exhausted, his syntax slipping. A direct translation would have made him retract, deflect, shut down the entire line of questioning. So she'd translated it ambiguously, preserving the admission, while making it sound like imprecise language rather than confession. The prosecutors had understood. They'd pressed harder. And 3 weeks later, sanctions had shifted. "That," Park said quietly, "was when I learned your name." Naomi set down the notepad, and her hands were shaking slightly. "Why tell me this now?" "Because I've been watching you for 2 years." The words should have been threatening. Instead, they felt like something else, like an answer to a question she'd been too afraid to ask. Park leaned forward slightly. "When you disappeared from Geneva, I understood why. I know about the men who came to your apartment. I know about your mother." He paused. "I know what she heard." Naomi's throat tightened. "Is she safe?" "In Lagos, under protection I arranged after you vanished." Park's expression softened. "She asked me not to contact you. She believed you were safer invisible." The relief hit so hard Naomi nearly gasped. 2 years of not knowing. 2 years of silence and survival, and the terrible possibility that her mother was dead in a ditch somewhere because she'd cleaned the wrong office at the wrong time. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Naomi's voice cracked slightly. "Why let me serve wine for 18 months when you knew—" "Because you needed to disappear," Park said simply. "The people looking for your mother were looking for you too. They're no longer a threat, but that's a recent development. And because—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I needed to know if your silence was permanent, or if your voice was simply waiting." "For what?" "For something worth the risk of being seen again." Park stood, moving to the bookshelf. He pulled down a thin folder and set it on the desk between them. "There are rooms in this city where decisions are made, and treaties negotiated, agreements that never see official channels, conversations that shape policy without fingerprints." He opened the folder. Inside were photographs, meeting rooms, faces Naomi recognized from international news, documents in multiple languages. "These rooms need translators," Park continued, "but not the official kind, not the ones who appear in minutes or transcripts. They need people who understand that translation isn't just accuracy. It's discretion, strategy, power." Naomi stared at the folder, at the faces, at the implications. "You want me to spy. I want you to translate." Park's voice was firm, with the understanding that translation at this level has consequences, that your choice of words can prevent wars or start them, that invisibility in the right context acts as its own kind of weapon. He closed the folder. "I watched you tonight because I needed to know if you still had the courage to speak when speaking carried a cost. Minjae was a test you didn't know you were taking." Park's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "You passed." Naomi's mind raced. Geneva, her mother, 2 years of hiding, 2 years of surviving by making herself forgettable, and now this. An invitation to step back into the light, but in shadows. To use her voice again, but only in rooms where voices determined who lived and died. "If you accept," Park said quietly, "your voice will never be hidden again, but it will never be fully yours either. You'll belong to the spaces between languages, the gaps where truth gets translated into policy." He pushed the folder toward her. "Take the night, or think about it, but understand, once you say yes, there's no returning to invisibility." Naomi looked at the folder, at the door behind her. at the man who'd somehow known exactly where she was for 2 years and had chosen this moment, this specific, calculated moment to offer her a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Because survival was one thing, but living was something else entirely. Kang Min-jae didn't fall. Not immediately, not dramatically, he simply receded. The first sign came 3 days later when his name disappeared from the guest list at the Hanam-dong Charity Gala, the kind of event where absence was noted, catalogued, and interpreted. The organizers offered no explanation. They didn't need to. In circles where reputation was currency, silence was its own kind of announcement. By the following week, and his standing reservation at La Lumière Noire had been quietly cancelled. Victor handled it personally, a brief phone call that Min-jae didn't argue against. He understood what the cancellation meant, not punishment, but pruning, the removal of dead weight before it could contaminate healthier branches. His business partners began taking meetings without him, not openly, not with confrontation. They simply stopped CCing him on certain emails, stopped inviting him to certain dinners. His opinions, once solicited and amplified, were now politely acknowledged and promptly ignored. The firm's quarterly reports still listed his name. Buried 3 pages deep, his decision-making authority quietly redistributed to colleagues who'd spent years watching him mistake cruelty for strategy. No one explained why. No one needed to. But in rooms where reputation traveled faster than facts, the story had already circulated. Kang Min-jae had tried to humiliate service staff in front of witnesses, had used language as a weapon, had been publicly corrected by someone he'd assumed was beneath correction, and then, most damningly, had been forced to apologize by Chairman Park. That last detail did more damage than all the others combined, because it confirmed what many had suspected but few had dared voice. Min-jae's power had always been borrowed, contingent, the kind that existed only in the absence of someone more powerful saying no. Yura made her decision on day 4. She didn't make a scene, didn't issue statements or post cryptic messages on social media. She simply removed herself with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning the exit for longer than anyone realized. In the apartment in Cheongdam-dong, the one Min-jae had purchased in his name alone, assuming ownership was proof of devotion, was cleared of her belongings within 6 hours. Designer clothes, jewelry, the small collection of books she'd kept by the bedside, all of it vanished as if she'd never existed there at all. She left behind only one thing. The engagement ring, placed precisely in the center of the dining table they'd never actually used for dining. No note, no explanation. The ring said everything. Min-jae found it when he returned from a meeting that had been canceled without notification. Another small humiliation in a growing collection. He stood in the empty apartment in the silence that used to feel like luxury and now felt like judgment, and understood that Yura hadn't left because of what happened at the restaurant. And she'd left because the restaurant had finally given her permission. He called her once. She didn't answer. He didn't call again. By the 3rd week, Min-jae had stopped going to his office entirely. Not because he'd been fired, his family's stake in the firm made termination complicated, but because the subtle architecture of exclusion had become unbearable. The meetings that happened without him, the deals that closed without his input, the younger associates who no longer sought his mentorship, who'd learned that association with his name now carried risk instead of reward. He spent his days in the Cheongdam-dong apartment, surrounded by furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries, discovering that luxury was a poor substitute for respect. His phone still rang occasionally, but the calls were different now, shorter, more transactional. The social invitations had dried up entirely, replaced by the kind of polite distance that preceded complete irrelevance. No one confronted him. No one needed to. In a world where power was measured by proximity and access, Min-jae had simply been moved to the periphery. Not expelled, that would require explanation, documentation, mess, but relocated to a space where his presence no longer mattered. He thought about that night sometimes. About the waitress who'd spoken in languages he'd used as weapons. About the moment he'd realized she wasn't what he'd assumed. About Chairman Park's quiet, devastating intervention. He thought about calling Park, apologizing properly, attempting repair. He never did because he understood, finally, what he should have known all along. Some humiliations couldn't be undone with apologies. Some mistakes weren't dramatic failures, but quiet revelations. The moment when everyone watching realized that the Emperor's clothes had always been invisible, and they'd simply been too polite to mention it until someone else did first. Kang Min-jae didn't rage against his diminishment. He didn't fight or scheme or plot revenge. He simply accepted it with the numb resignation of someone who'd spent his entire life confusing fear with respect, and had finally learned the difference too late to matter. Some men fall loudly, their collapse documented and dissected. Others simply disappear, and by the end of the month, when people mentioned Kang Min-jae's name at all, it was always in the past tense, as if he'd already become history, a cautionary tale told in whispers, a reminder that cruelty without consequence was a temporary condition, not a permanent state, and that sometimes the quietest endings were the most complete. 6 months later, Naomi Carter sat in a room with no windows. The table was oval, polished to a mirror finish. Around it sat 7 people whose names would never appear in meeting minutes, whose decisions would ripple through policy papers and diplomatic cables without attribution, whose conversations existed in the careful gap between official record and actual power. They were arguing about water rights, or more precisely, they were arguing about the language that would be used to describe water rights in a treaty between 2 countries that had spent the last decade pretending they weren't on the brink of war. The Korean text uses Gongdong Gwali, the delegate from Seoul said, tapping the document. Shared management. But the Chinese translation renders it as Gongtong Kongji, shared control. Control implies dominance. Management implies partnership. Perhaps, the Chinese representative countered smoothly, your translator misunderstood the intent. Naomi didn't look up from her notepad. She'd heard this move before. The deliberate mistranslation, the strategic ambiguity, the attempt to win in translation what couldn't be won in negotiation. She waited 3 seconds, then spoke. Gongxiang Guanli would be the precise equivalent, she said in Mandarin, her voice carrying the neutral authority she'd learned to wield like a scalpel. Shared management without the hierarchical implications of Kongji. Unless the intent was to introduce hierarchy where the Korean text specified partnership. She looked up then, meeting the Chinese delegate's eyes. Oh, in which case we should clarify that intent before proceeding, because treaty language once signed becomes permanent. The room went quiet, not the hostile silence of confrontation, but the productive silence of people recognizing that someone had just prevented a disaster disguised as a comma. The delegate nodded slowly. Shared management is acceptable. Naomi made a note. The meeting continued. 2 hours later, she emerged into the late afternoon sun of downtown Seoul, her tablet tucked under her arm, her heels clicking against pavement, with a rhythm that no longer hurt. She'd traded her restaurant uniform for tailored suits in charcoal and navy, traded her splitting shoes for leather that actually fit, traded her bow tie for the kind of simple jewelry that signaled competence without demanding attention. But the biggest change wasn't visible. It was in the way she moved through the world, no longer invisible architecture, no longer the person others looked through. She was present now, necessary, The kind of presence that made rooms rearrange themselves slightly when she entered, not because she demanded it, but because her expertise had become indispensable. Park had been right about one thing. Translation at this level was strategy. Every word she chose carried weight. Every phrase she rendered could prevent conflicts or ignite them. She'd stopped 3 potential diplomatic incidents in 6 months, not through heroics or drama, but through the careful, precise work of making sure meaning traveled intact across languages that weren't designed to cooperate. She thought about her mother sometimes. They'd spoken once, briefly, 3 months ago. Adana was safe in Lagos, working in a legal aid office, using her languages to help refugees navigate asylum applications. They'd cried, they'd laughed, they'd agreed not to speak again for a while, not out of distance, but out of protection. Some connections survived best in silence. Naomi understood that now. She understood a lot of things she hadn't before. That invisibility had been survival, but it was never sustainable. That language wasn't just armor, it was identity, power, resistance. That being seen came with risks, but being erased came with costs that compounded quietly until there was nothing left. She thought about Minjae occasionally, but only in passing. She'd heard the rumors of his diminishment, his quiet fade from relevance. She felt no satisfaction in it, no triumph. Just the calm recognition that some consequences arrived without requiring her participation. The evening air was cool. The city hummed with its usual chaos. Traffic, voices, the eternal motion of millions of people negotiating space and survival. Naomi walked through it with her head up, her posture straight, her presence no longer apologizing for existing. She'd been invisible once. She'd worn silence like camouflage. She'd made herself small enough to slip through the gaps in powerful people's attention. She'd survived by erasing everything that made her remarkable, dangerous, seen. And she'd learned that survival, while necessary, was never enough. Because language, real language, the kind her mother had taught her, the kind she'd wielded in Geneva, the kind she'd finally reclaimed in a restaurant where a man tried to use words as weapons. Language was meant to be spoken, not hidden, not hoarded, not used only in moments of crisis when silence became impossible. She reached her apartment, modest still but hers, bought with earnings that didn't require tips or double shifts, and stood for a moment at the threshold. Inside was a desk covered in documents in 7 languages, a bookshelf holding dictionaries and grammar guides and the collected works of translators who'd understood that words were how the world remade itself. Outside was a city where her voice now mattered, where meetings waited for her input, where mistakes she prevented would never make headlines because the best translation was invisible. Not because the translator was erased, but because the meaning traveled so smoothly it seemed inevitable. She stepped inside, closed the door, and smiled. She had been invisible once, but never again. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, share it with someone who's ever been silenced or overlooked. Like this video to support stories that turn humiliation into power, and subscribe to the channel, because this isn't just storytelling. This is where dignity wins.